It's now my privilege to introduce our speaker for this morning, Dr. Ron White. Dr. White is the author of the New York Times bestseller, A Lincoln, a Biography. His topic for this morning reflects his work as a Lincoln scholar and author of numerous books about the 16th president. In fact, the speech is entitled Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount. USA Today has said if you read one book about Lincoln, make it this one. White's other works include Lincoln's Greatest Speech, the second inaugural, a New York Times notable book, as well as The Eloquent President, a portrait of Lincoln through his words, a Los Angeles Times bestseller. Dr. White holds a BA from UCLA, an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary, and a PhD in history from Princeton University. He is a fellow at the Huntington Library and a visiting professor of history at UCLA. And on a personal note, years ago when I was an MDiv student at Princeton Seminary myself, Dr. White was my American church history professor. I still treasure the courses I enjoyed with him and the topics we studied under his guidance. He was as helpful then as he is today at helping us understand the role that faith plays in the nuances of our everyday life and indeed the nuances of our country's life. He was so helpful to so many of us and continues to provide this guidance to many audiences today, including many government offices, many church communities, and many communities around the world. Thank you for allowing us to see the vital and pivotal role that our own faith can play as we go forward. Dr. White, thank you for coming today. It's a pleasure to welcome you to Westmont.
To the class of 2013 and the class of 1963, to President Beebe, the Board of Trustees, distinguished faculty, parents, friends, supporters, I'm privileged to participate in this exciting morning with you. The movie Lincoln has captivated audiences in recent months, not simply in the United States, but all around the world. Going against the grain of Hollywood instead of sex and violence, this movie focuses on the big idea of the passage of the 13th Amendment to remove slavery from our nation forever. Instead of pyrotechnics, the action is in the words. Can you believe 145 speaking parts? Lincoln, inhabited by Daniel Day-Lewis, emerges as both down-home and high-spirited, a man of humor, and adroit politicians who might give lessons to today's presidents. A debate among moviegoers, however, became whether the movie ended in the right place. Some thought it should have ended when Lincoln walked out of the White House for the last time for Ford's Theater. Instead, after Lincoln's death, the movie circles back in its conclusion to Lincoln delivering his majestic second inaugural address on March 4, 1865. But only part of the address. But only part of the address. What the movie leaves out, I want to sketch in this morning. As a biographer, I have discovered that again and again, the biographies of our most notable Americans leave out the faith story. For the recent movie 42, if you haven't seen it yet, Eric Metaxas, the wonderful biographer of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, wrote in an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal recently that Hollywood once again, and I love his phrase, pitched around the faith story. Oh, it's there a little bit in Branch Rickey, but not at all in Jackie Robinson, who was nurtured in his Bible-believing church in Pasadena, California, which gave him the ability to turn the other cheek when that became the confrontation of his life. Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount is a remarkable address because although I want to portray Lincoln as a person of history, he is someone who remarkably speaks across time to us today. The day after he delivered his address, a young reporter in Washington called it, "This was Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount." If Sunday by Sunday you and I listen to the exposition of scriptures in the churches we attend, I want to ask us to explore on this Saturday morning what I will call American Scripture. In 701 words, the second shortest inaugural address ever offered, Lincoln will mention God 14 times quote the Bible 4 times and invoke prayer 3 times. Now, the point isn't to count, but rather to explore the meaning of Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount and how it still might speak to us today. In your program for the day, on the very last page, is the text of Lincoln's second inaugural. Lincoln begins at this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office. There is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. This is not exactly 77 years ago. We're not sure where Lincoln is going. In the first paragraph, he breaks all the modern patterns of leadership where politicians promise everything they're going to do for us. Lincoln actually diminishes our expectations. In the second paragraph, Lincoln asks a question that no one was asking. Sadly, not the preachers are asking. I would suggest that part of our education going forward is to ask the right questions. Lincoln's asking the question, how can the South be brought back into the Union? And he understands that if the South is meant to bear alone the shame and the blame for this Civil War, they will never be able to be brought back into the Union. And so his first rhetorical strategy is to use what I call inclusive language. Notice it there in the second paragraph. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. Towards the end of the paragraph, both parties deprecated war. Lincoln is suggesting that the people of the South did not want the war any more than the people of the North. In our sharing our faith and our ideas, Lincoln is saying to us, we begin with affirmation of the motivations of the people who might even be our opponents. Even if we disagree with their ideas, we begin with the affirmation of their ideas. A remarkable thing in Lincoln's second inaugural address and in his Gettysburg Address is what I call Lincoln's disappearance. In the Gettysburg Address, he uses not one personal pronoun. In the second inaugural address, he uses only 2 personal pronouns. As I read this week President Beebe's wonderful book on leadership, I turned again and again to the fact that modern leadership is infected by the egocentric attitude of those who wish to be leaders. Lincoln points beyond himself. You and I who are called to be followers of Christ, even though it's our Christian experience, we are called to point beyond ourselves to the Christ who calls us. When we get down to the third paragraph, Lincoln invites us to take quite a remarkable turn. Halfway down, he says, both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God. He is saying to his audience, the people of the South read the Bible every bit as much as the people of the North. The Confederate soldiers read the Bible every bit as much as the soldiers in the Union Army. When they cleared the Gettysburg battlefield of 50,000 dead, wounded, and missing soldiers to prepare for the first dedication of a national military cemetery, they wanted to take from those bodies the diaries, the letters, the money, the watches. The parents, wives could come and retrieve them. What they chiefly found were Bibles. Both sides read the same Bible. But then Lincoln uses this remarkable semicolon. As we have been kind of short-cutting our English language, the semicolon is dropped out of this. Lincoln's semicolon suggests to us that there is now a shift. And so the shift is that some of these people now dare to pray to a God to be on their side. And Lincoln is asking the question, really, how can we possibly appeal to God as a territorial God or a tribal God? Lincoln is saying across time, God is the God who is what he loves to call the Almighty. This is God. But after saying this, he then starts into another direction. I struggle to find the antecedents of this address. You can find the antecedent of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. You can find the antecedents of John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. You can't find this one except in a remarkable personal conversation. 3 months to the day before he gave the address, 2 women came to see him. Their husbands were Confederate officers confined to a Union prison. They knew that Lincoln was sure to respond to the appeals of women who came to plead for their husbands, fathers, sons, who had fallen asleep on duty, failed to report to work. These women said to Lincoln, "Our husbands are religious men." And Lincoln said, "How very interesting. Come back tomorrow. Let's continue the conversation." And on the second day, he said to them, "I find it very difficult when you say to me your husbands are religious men. How can religious men go against the duly constituted authority of this nation?" And then in his own words, and it's hard to see in the small print here, I must have to say, that these men, and he's now quoting Genesis 9:19, are using the sweat of other men's labor for their own good. What Lincoln is doing here is saying that the Bible, which he knew large parts of from memory, is not simply there and then back in the past as an historical document, but surely you know that the Bible is here and now as something that still speaks to us today. Lincoln continues with his address and changes the direction one more time. He affirms the Almighty has his own purposes. The thundering indictment indicative that God is the one who rules in history. But then he makes one more change. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. Now, if we're honest, inaugural addresses are really often efforts of self-congratulation. Thomas Jefferson, "Oh, thank you so much for electing me a second term. I know you realize what a tremendous job I did in my first term." And they're also, if I can say this in polite company, they're also efforts of self-congratulation about our nation. We are such a great nation. Suddenly, Lincoln changes the tone of his address and says, "Woe unto the world because of offenses," quoting from the Gospel of Matthew. And what is that offense? Lincoln suggests that it is slavery. The whole nation is involved in the issue of slavery. He then moves on to some of the most evocative words of his entire address. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses, which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war. At that moment, the reporter for the Times of London, looking out across the audience, sometimes you see things when you're standing outside of a culture, began to think that he heard something from the back of the audience. There was a group of people there on a very rainy, windy, muddy day who were clustered towards the back. He thought that perhaps they had never been to an inaugural address before, and as he strained to hear what they were saying, he caught it. They began to say softly, but the chant went forward, "Bless the Lord, bless the Lord, bless the Lord, bless the Lord." The African Americans in the crowd took up the chant, "Bless the Lord." Frederick Douglass, the greatest African American of the 19th century, was in the crowd, and as he looked around, he wrote later in his diary that evening, "This was not a state paper. This was a sermon." In conclusion, if you and I think about sermons then and now, they really have two parts to them. The first is what I'm going to call the indicative. It is when the youth leader, the minister, the pastor, the preacher announces to us that in the birth, life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, God has come into the world. The indicative, what God has done. But I don't know the churches that you attend, but the one that I attend, usually the pastor towards the end of the sermon leans forward, often in a more folksy way, and says, "And now, dear friends, in the coming week, I ask you," this is the imperative. Paul, in the letter to the Ephesians, in the first 3 chapters, tells what God has done, and then chapter 4, verse 1, "I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, ask you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called." I think Lincoln must have thought long and hard as he came to his final paragraph. He'd been speaking only about 5.5 minutes. People were still arriving as he was concluding. He understood that he was speaking to a deeply divided nation. Could he possibly ask them for forgiveness and reconciliation? Dear friends, we live in a deeply divided nation. The Christian faith offers the message of reconciliation. And in our conclusion to this commencement address, I'm going to ask us to say together Lincoln's imperative. Although written many, many years ago, I still believe that it speaks across time to what you and I can do as we move from this marvelous commencement service to take our place as Christ's disciples in the world. May we say this together. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Amen.